Nothing breaks your heart quite like watching love end at a graveside. Two German shepherd puppies sat beside their owner's fresh grave, trembling in the rain, waiting for Martha Henderson to come home one last time. The mourners had all gone, leaving these innocent souls alone in a world that suddenly made no sense. From the edge of the woods, Eli Hartwell watched the heartbreaking scene unfold. At 63, he knew what abandonment felt like. 10 years ago, this homeless man had been the town's most respected carpenter, with steady hands and a proud family. Now those same hands shook as he approached the whimpering puppies. The smaller one looked up at him with eyes full of the same pain Eli carried every day. What happens when a broken man finds two broken hearts that need exactly what he needs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A crumpled funeral program caught against Eli Hartwell's boot as he stood at the cemetery's edge, watching the last of the mourners disappear down the winding gravel path. He bent slowly, his weathered joints protesting, and smoothed out the damp paper. Martha Henderson's gentle face smiled back at him from a photograph that must have been taken decades ago, when her hair was still brown and her eyes held the brightness of someone who believed tomorrow would always be better than today. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, but the two German shepherd puppies remained motionless beside the grave, their dark coats soaked through. They couldn't have been more than 4 months old, still small enough that their oversized paws promised they'd grow into something magnificent. The larger of the two, a male with distinctive tan markings around his ears, kept his nose pressed against the freshly turned earth, as if he could still catch his owner's scent beneath the flowers and soil. His sister, Eli, could see the gentle feminine features in her smaller frame, sat perfectly still, her intelligent brown eyes fixed on the headstone as though she were reading the words carved there. Eli had been living in these woods for so long that he'd become part of the landscape. The townsfolk who occasionally glimpsed him on their hiking trails or fishing expeditions had stopped seeing him as a person years ago. He was simply another element of the forest, like the ancient oak trees or the creek that ran through the valley. But before the woods claimed him, before the bottles and the grief and the crushing weight of failure had driven him from everything decent in his life, Eli Hartwell had been somebody. 23 years he'd worked as a carpenter in Millbrook, building homes with his own 2 hands that still stood strong and proud along the tree-lined streets. His workshop on Maple Avenue had been a place of creation, where rough lumber transformed into kitchen cabinets, front porches, and custom furniture that families passed down through generations. Children would stop to watch him work through the open bay doors, mesmerized by the way his hands could coax beauty from simple wood. He'd always had time for their questions, their wide-eyed wonder at seeing something useful emerge from what had started as a tree. Those same hands that had once crafted rocking chairs and dining room tables now trembled as he tucked the funeral program into the breast pocket of his tattered coat. The arthritis had settled deep into his knuckles, and the years of sleeping rough had left him stiff and slow. But muscle memory ran deeper than time or hardship, and sometimes, when he built his makeshift shelters from fallen branches and salvaged materials, he could feel echoes of the craftsman he used to be. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of crisp fall day when the maple trees blazed red and gold against an impossibly blue sky. Eli had been driving to a job site, coffee growing cold in the cup holder, his mind already focused on the day's work ahead. He never saw the delivery truck that ran the red light at the intersection of Main and 3rd. The impact had sent his pickup spinning across 2 lanes of traffic before it slammed into the courthouse steps. His wife, Sarah, had been in the passenger seat. She'd insisted on riding along that morning, claiming she wanted to see the Victorian house he was restoring on the east side of town. They'd been married 26 years, and she still got excited about his projects, still marveled at his ability to see potential in the most decrepit structures. The paramedics had worked on her for 47 minutes before they finally gave up, their faces grim with the kind of professional defeat that comes from fighting a battle they knew they couldn't win. Eli had survived with a broken collarbone, 3 cracked ribs, and a head injury that left him unconscious for 2 days. When he finally woke up in the hospital, his daughter Claire was holding his hand, her face streaked with tears she'd been crying for longer than she could remember. She'd been the one to tell him about Sarah, her voice breaking on every other word as she tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly lost all its meaning. The insurance settlement had covered the medical bills and left him with enough money to disappear if he wanted to. And that's exactly what he'd done. He'd sold the house on Elm Street, where Sarah had tended her prize-winning roses and served Sunday dinners to 3 generations of family. He'd closed the workshop and sold his tools to younger carpenters who promised to put them to good use. He'd given Claire enough money to finish college and start her adult life without the burden of caring for a father who'd already decided he had nothing left to offer the world. Claire had fought him on every decision, begging him to stay, to get help, to let her love him through the grief that was eating him alive from the inside out. But Eli had seen the relief in her eyes when he finally drove away from Millbrook, his truck loaded with camping gear and a dozen bottles of whiskey that he'd promised himself would help him forget. She was 22 years old, beautiful and smart, and full of dreams that didn't include watching her father drink himself to death in the house where her mother used to sing while she cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings. The drinking had taken 5 years to kill the man he used to be. The woods had claimed what was left, accepting him without judgment or expectation. He'd built himself a shelter from salvaged plywood and corrugated metal, hidden deep enough in the forest that the occasional park ranger never found it. A small creek provided fresh water, and he'd become skilled at finding food in ways that would have horrified the man who used to buy his groceries from Morrison's Market every Saturday morning. But Martha Henderson had noticed him. Looking at her photograph now, Eli remembered the first time he'd seen her, maybe 3 years ago. She'd been walking her dogs along the forest trail that skirted his territory, 2 magnificent German shepherds who moved with the confident grace of animals that had never known hunger or abandonment. The older one, a male with silver starting, to show around his muzzle, had caught Eli's scent and alerted. His ears pricked forward as he scanned the tree line where Eli crouched behind a fallen log. Martha had spoken to her dogs with the kind of gentle authority that came from years of patient training. She'd known Eli was there, had probably known for months before that first encounter, but she'd never called out to him, never tried to approach or offer help that would have felt like charity. Instead, she'd begun leaving things, small things. At first, a thermos of hot coffee tied to a tree branch, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and placed on a stump where she knew he'd find it. Later, as the seasons changed and winter settled over the mountains, the gifts had grown more substantial. A warm blanket, a pair of boots that fit perfectly, still in the box, with a receipt that showed she'd paid full price, rather than picking them up at a thrift store. The old German shepherd had died the previous winter, and Eli had watched from his hiding place. As Martha grieved for the companion who'd shared 15 years of her life, she'd gotten the puppies in the spring, 2 beautiful creatures who'd brought light back to her morning walks. Eli had seen her training them, her patience infinite as she taught them to heel and stay and come when called. The male had been eager and bold, always the first to investigate new smells or sounds. The female had been more thoughtful, watching her brother's adventures from a safe distance before deciding whether she wanted to participate. Now they sat beside Martha's grave like living tombstones, their vigil a testament to the love that had shaped their short lives. Eli knew that feeling, the hollow ache of waiting for someone who would never come home. He'd spent the first year after Sarah's death checking his watch at 5:30 every evening, the time she used to start dinner. His body had learned rhythms that his mind couldn't abandon, patterns of expectation that persisted long after hope had died. The cemetery was empty now except for Eli and the puppies and the ghosts of all the conversations that had taken place. Over Martha's grave that afternoon, he'd heard fragments of them from his position in the trees, voices carried on the wind, telling stories about a woman who'd worked as a nurse at the county hospital for 37 years. She'd never married, had no children, but she'd touched more lives than most people with big families and wide social circles. Patients had remembered her gentle hands and quiet voice during their most frightening moments. Colleagues had spoken of her reliability, her willingness to work extra shifts when the need arose, her gift for making the worst days somehow bearable. The puppies stirred as Eli approached, the male lifting his head to watch this stranger emerge from the woods. His sister remained focused on the grave, but Eli could see the tension in her small body, the way her muscles coiled in preparation for flight. These weren't feral animals. Their fear was specific and recent, born from the confusion of losing the only security they'd ever known. Eli stopped 6 feet away, close enough to see the intelligence in their dark eyes, but far enough to avoid triggering their flight instinct. He lowered himself slowly to his knees, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The wet grass soaked through his pants immediately, but he'd long ago stopped caring about discomfort that didn't threaten his survival. "I know," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "I know exactly how you feel." The male puppy's ears twitched at the sound of human speech, but he didn't move away. His sister finally looked up from the grave, her expression so heartbroken that Eli felt something crack inside his chest, some protective wall he'd built around the part of himself that still cared about anything beyond his next meal or dry place to sleep. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the cemetery wrapped in the kind of peaceful silence that comes after storms. In that quiet space, 3 broken souls began the delicate process of recognizing each other, understanding that sometimes the most unlikely families are born from the deepest kinds of loss. The first approach required patience that Eli had forgotten. He possessed. He remained kneeling in the wet grass for nearly an hour, speaking in low, gentle tones about nothing in particular: the weather, the beautiful flowers on Martha's grave, the way the evening light filtered through the oak trees that bordered the cemetery. The puppies watched him with the wary intelligence of animals who'd learned that the world could change without warning, that safety was something that could disappear between one heartbeat and the next. The male was the first to show curiosity. His ears would prick forward whenever Eli's voice carried a particular warmth, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to shift his weight forward. Not enough to constitute movement, but enough to suggest that some part of him wanted to trust this strange man who smelled like the woods and spoke with the same patient cadence Martha had used during their training sessions. His sister remained, fixed on the grave, her small body radiating a grief that Eli recognized in his bones. She was the one who'd been closest to Martha, he realized. The male had been bold and adventurous, eager to explore the world beyond their yard, but the female had preferred to stay close to their owner's side. She'd been the shadow that followed Martha from room to room, the companion who'd learned to read her moods and respond to her unspoken needs. "She loved you both very much," Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone can see that just by looking at you. The way you sit, the way you wait. She taught you that love means staying close to the people who matter." The female's ears twitched, and for just a moment her eyes met his. In that brief connection, Eli saw the depth of her confusion and loss. She was trying to be good, trying to follow the last instruction Martha had given her, but she didn't understand why her person wasn't coming back to tell her what to do next. The temperature was dropping as the sun settled behind the mountains, and Eli could see both puppies beginning to shiver. Their coats were soaked through, and they'd been sitting in the cold rain for hours. Without food or shelter, they wouldn't survive the night, especially if the temperature continued to fall. The forecast had called for possible frost, unusual for this time of year, but not unheard of in the mountain elevations. Eli reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out the last of his dinner. half a peanut butter sandwich he'd been saving. For later. The bread was slightly stale, and the peanut butter had separated in the heat, but it was food, and he could see the male's nose twitch as the scent reached him. The puppy's stomach gave an audible rumble, confirming what Eli had suspected. They hadn't eaten since Martha had fed them that morning, before she'd left for the doctor's appointment that had ended with her heart giving out in the waiting room. He tore the sandwich into small pieces and placed them on the ground between himself and the puppies, then settled back to wait. The male watched every movement with intense focus, his body language torn between hunger and caution. His training told him not to approach strangers, but his empty stomach argued for a different kind of wisdom. It took another 20 minutes, but eventually hunger won. The male crept forward on his belly, moving with the careful precision of an animal who'd learned that sudden movements could have consequences. He snatched the first piece of sandwich and retreated quickly, chewing with the focused intensity of someone who wasn't sure when their next meal might come. The taste must have triggered memories of Martha's kitchen, because suddenly his tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of anything resembling happiness Eli had seen from either puppy. Encouraged, the male approached again, this time with slightly more confidence. He took the second piece and actually remained in place to eat it, his eyes never leaving Eli's face. "Good boy," Eli murmured, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He hadn't praised anyone or anything in so long that he'd forgotten how good it felt to acknowledge someone else's courage, even if it was just the courage to eat a piece of sandwich from a stranger's hand. The female watched her brother's success with growing interest, but she remained beside the grave, loyalty warring with necessity. Eli could see her internal struggle in the way her body leaned slightly forward while her paws stayed planted firmly in place. She wanted to trust him, wanted to accept his offering, but something deeper than hunger was holding her back. Eli had an idea. He stood slowly, his knees protesting after the long period of kneeling, and walked to Martha's headstone. The female's eyes tracked his movement, her body tensing as he approached her sacred post. But instead of trying to move her away from the grave, Eli knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not so close that she felt trapped. "She's not really gone, you know," he said softly, placing his hand gently on the earth above Martha's coffin. "People we love, they stay with us in here." He touched his chest, right over his heart. "Martha's still with you. She's in the way you know to sit and stay and wait. She's in the way you look after your brother. She's in that loyalty that won't let you leave this place." The female's tail gave the slightest movement, not quite a wag, but an acknowledgement that she was listening. Eli reached into his pocket again and pulled out the red collar he'd noticed around her neck. It was slightly too big, probably purchased with her adult size in mind, and a small metal tag dangled from it with Martha's name and phone number engraved in neat block letters. The sight of that collar, with its evidence of Martha's love and planning for the future, nearly broke Eli's resolve. This woman had expected to watch these puppies grow into magnificent dogs. She'd bought them collars they'd grow into, had probably already started planning for their training and socialization. The puppies weren't just orphaned. They were the living embodiment of dreams that would never be fulfilled. "Martha Henderson," Eli read aloud from the tag, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave you this because she wanted everyone to know you. Belonged to someone who cared. That doesn't change just because she can't be here to tell them herself." The female turned to look at him directly for the first time, her brown eyes bright with intelligence and unshed tears. Dogs did cry, Eli knew. Not with salt water like humans, but with body language that spoke of grief too deep for sounds. This little girl was crying with her entire being, mourning not just Martha's absence, but the loss of her place in the world. "I can't replace her," Eli continued, his voice barely audible. "Nobody could do that, but I can make sure you're safe while you figure out what comes next. I can make sure you don't have to be alone tonight." The offer hung in the air between them, a bridge built from mutual recognition of loss. The female studied his face with the kind of intense scrutiny that suggested she was making a decision that would affect the rest of her life. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she slowly, carefully, stood up from her vigil beside Martha's grave. She approached the scattered pieces of sandwich with dignity and tact, her movements graceful despite her youth. She ate, delicately, as Martha had probably taught her, chewing thoroughly and keeping her eyes on Eli's face as if trying to read his intentions. When she finished, she sat back on her haunches and tilted her head slightly to one side, a gesture so perfectly reminiscent of an adult German shepherd that Eli felt his chest tighten with recognition of the magnificent animal she would become. The male, emboldened by his sister's acceptance, trotted over to investigate Eli more thoroughly. His nose worked overtime, cataloguing scents that told the story of a man who lived outdoors, who cooked over fires and slept under stars. There was no judgment in that exploration, only curiosity and the beginning of trust. As the last light faded, from the sky and the cemetery settled into darkness, Eli made a decision that would change all their lives. He couldn't leave them here to face the cold night alone, couldn't walk away from the same helpless grief that had nearly destroyed him 10 years ago. Martha had seen something worth saving in him when she'd left those small gifts tied to trees. Maybe it was time for him to see something worth saving in himself. "Come on then," he said quietly, standing and brushing the grass from his knees. "Let's go home." The walk through the woods required more negotiation than Eli had anticipated. The puppies followed him willingly enough once they left the cemetery, but their short legs and lingering exhaustion meant frequent stops. The male, whom Eli had started thinking of as scout for his bold, exploratory nature, would bound ahead a few yards before remembering his manners and returning to heel beside his sister. The female, more cautious and still processing her grief, stayed close to Eli's side, occasionally brushing against his leg as if seeking reassurance that he wouldn't disappear like Martha had. Eli's shelter sat in a small clearing about 2 miles. Into the forest, hidden behind a natural screen of mountain laurel and wild rhododendron. He'd chosen the location carefully during his first year in the woods, looking for a spot that offered protection from both the elements and unwanted human contact. A small stream provided fresh water year-round, and the thick canopy overhead kept the worst of the weather at bay, while still allowing enough sunlight to filter through during the day. What he'd built there wasn't much to look at, but it represented 9 years of careful improvements and hard-learned lessons about survival. The main structure was barely 8 feet by 10 feet, constructed from salvaged materials he'd scavenged from construction sites and the county dump. Sheets of plywood formed the walls, sealed against moisture with tar paper he'd found discarded. Behind a roofing company, the roof was corrugated metal, angled to shed rain into a series of collection barrels he'd positioned around the perimeter. Inside, the space was divided into sleeping and storage areas with a small wood-burning stove he'd assembled from a discarded water heater and scrap metal piping. The floor was packed earth covered with salvaged carpeting, and wooden crates served as furniture, seating, tables, and storage for the few possessions he'd accumulated over the years. It wasn't much, but it was dry and warm and private, which was more than many homeless people could claim. The puppy's reaction to his home was immediate and positive. Scout began investigating every corner with tail-wagging enthusiasm, his nose working overtime to catalogue new and interesting scents. His sister was more reserved, but Eli could see her beginning to relax as she realized this was a real shelter, a place where someone had clearly made an effort to create comfort and security. "Not exactly a mansion," Eli said, lighting the kerosene lantern that provided his evening illumination, "but it's warm and dry, and that's what matters tonight." The female settled herself near the door, positioned so she could watch both Eli and the exit, classic behavior for an animal that wasn't quite ready to trust completely, but was willing to accept temporary safety. Scout, meanwhile, had discovered Eli's small cache of tools and was investigating a hand plane with intense curiosity. "Careful there," Eli said, gently redirecting the puppy away from the sharp metal blade. "Those aren't toys. The tools were the one piece of his former life he hadn't been able to abandon completely. Hidden beneath a tarp in the corner of the shelter, they represented 23 years of craftsmanship and professional pride. There was a full set of hand planes, several different saws, multiple sets of chisels, measuring tools, and the leather tool belt he'd worn to every job site. He hadn't touched most of them in years, but he still cleaned and oiled them regularly, maintaining them out of habit and some deep, stubborn belief that craftsmanship deserved respect even when it served no practical purpose. Looking at the tools now, through the eyes of someone responsible for 2 hungry puppies, Eli felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. These weren't just nostalgic artifacts, they were instruments of creation, tools that could transform raw materials into useful things. Things like proper shelter for animals, that deserved better than a makeshift lean-to and whatever scraps he could scavenge from town. But first, he needed to address more immediate concerns. The puppies hadn't eaten a real meal in over 24 hours, and his own food supplies were running dangerously low. His usual routine involved checking dumpsters behind restaurants and grocery stores, supplemented by occasional fishing in the stream when he could find or make appropriate tackle. Neither option would provide the kind of nutrition growing puppies required, and winter was approaching fast enough that he couldn't afford to let them lose weight or strength. He opened his largest storage crate and inventoried his supplies. 3 cans of soup, a partial loaf of bread that was starting to go stale, a jar of peanut butter with maybe 2 sandwiches worth remaining, and a bag of rice that was down to its last few cups. In another crate, he found a tattered blanket that Martha had left tied to a tree branch the previous winter. It smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener and carried associations with a kind of domestic comfort he'd almost forgotten existed. The blanket became the puppy's bed, spread near the wood stove where they could benefit from its warmth without being too close to the flames. Eli opened one of his precious cans of soup, chicken noodle, which seemed most likely to agree with sensitive puppy stomachs, and heated it slowly, adding extra water to make it stretch further. The smell of cooking food filled the small space, and he could see both puppies watching his every movement with intense focus. "I know you're hungry," he said, stirring the soup carefully to prevent scorching. Just a few more minutes. While the soup heated, Eli found himself studying the puppies more carefully. Despite their ordeal, they were clearly healthy, well-cared-for animals. Their coats were thick and glossy, their teeth white and sharp, their bodies showing the sturdy development of puppies who'd never missed a meal until yesterday. Martha had obviously been a devoted owner, providing excellent veterinary care and nutrition during their critical early months. The female, he noticed, had a small scar on her left ear, probably from some minor puppy accident that had healed cleanly. The male had distinctive markings around his eyes that gave him an almost comical expression of permanent surprise. Both showed signs of early training. They knew how to sit on command, they didn't jump on people or furniture, and they waited patiently for permission before eating. Martha had been preparing them to be good citizens of the world, animals that would bring joy rather than problems to whatever family eventually adopted them. That thought stopped Eli cold. Adoption. Of course, these puppies would need real homes, permanent families who could provide the kind of life Martha had envisioned for them. He was just a temporary solution, a bridge between their old life and whatever came next. He couldn't keep them, couldn't provide the stability and resources they deserved. The most he could do was make sure they stayed healthy and socialized, until he could figure out how to get them to the right people. But even as he told himself this, Eli felt a strange reluctance to think about giving them up. For the first time in 9 years, his shelter felt like something more than a survival strategy. The presence of the puppies transformed the space, made it feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. Their quiet breathing and occasional, sleepy whimpers filled silences that had grown oppressive over the years of solitude. The soup was ready. Eli poured it into 2 shallow bowls he'd fashioned from tin cans, letting it cool while he prepared his own smaller portion. The puppies waited with admirable patience, their eyes tracking his every movement, but their bodies remaining in perfect sit-stay position until he gave them permission to eat. "Okay," he said finally, placing the bowls in front of them. "Go ahead." They ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, but also with the good manners Martha had taught them. No guarding behavior, no aggressive competition between siblings. When they finished, they both looked up at him with expressions of gratitude so clear that Eli felt his throat tighten with emotion. Outside, night settled over the forest with the complete darkness that only comes far from city lights. Inside the small shelter, 3 refugees from life's hardest blows settled down together for their first night as a family, none of them yet understanding that this temporary arrangement would become the foundation for healing they'd all thought was impossible. The key revealed itself 3 days later, glinting in the morning sunlight as Eli searched Martha's garden for any vegetables that might have survived the early frost. He'd been checking on her house daily, partly from curiosity about the woman who'd shown him such quiet kindness, but mostly from practical necessity. The puppies needed more food than his usual scavenging could provide, and Martha's garden might offer resources that could help stretch their meager supplies. The house at 847 Maple Street was a modest ranch-style home built sometime in the 1960s with white aluminum siding and dark green shutters that had been recently painted. The front yard was immaculate, with carefully tended flower beds that showcased Martha's love for gardening. Even now, weeks after her death, the late-blooming chrysanthemums provided splashes of gold and burgundy against the autumn landscape. But it was the backyard that told the real story of Martha's life. Here, she'd created a paradise designed specifically for her dogs. A 6-foot privacy fence enclosed nearly an acre of perfectly maintained lawn, with mature shade trees that provided natural cooling in summer. Custom-built doghouses sat in strategic locations, each equipped with cedar shavings and raised floors that would keep occupants dry and comfortable. An elaborate obstacle course of jumps, tunnels, and weaving poles suggested hours of training and play. The vegetable garden occupied a sunny corner, protected by rabbit fencing and organized with the precision of someone who took food production seriously. Even in the aftermath of the first frost, Eli could see evidence of a productive harvest. Mature tomato plants heavy with fruit, rows of winter squash ready for storage, and late-season greens that were actually improved by the cold weather. The key was buried in the soft soil beside the garden gate, wrapped in plastic and secured with a small note written in Martha's careful handwriting, "For emergencies, or anyone who needs help." Eli stared at the message for a long time, trying to understand what kind of person leaves a house key in their garden with instructions for strangers to use it if they needed help. It was the act of someone who fundamentally believed in human goodness, despite living in a world that provided plenty of evidence to the contrary. The puppies, Scout and Grace, as he'd begun calling them, names that seemed to fit their personalities, waited patiently while Eli wrestled with the ethics of using Martha's key. She was dead, and the house would eventually be sold or claimed by whatever distant relatives might exist. The food inside would spoil if no one used it, and the vegetables in the garden would rot with the coming of winter. From a practical standpoint, taking what he needed made perfect sense, but it felt like crossing a line, moving from grateful recipient of Martha's outdoor gifts to someone who entered her private space without explicit invitation. The key and note suggested permission, but permission given to whom? Had Martha known about his specific situation, Or was this a general gesture of kindness intended for any homeless person who might need shelter? Grace made the decision for him by slipping through the garden gate and heading straight for the back door, her tail wagging with recognition. This was her home, the place where she'd spent the first months of her life learning what love looked like. She sat beside the door and looked back at Eli expectantly, clearly confused about why they weren't going inside to wait for Martha. The key turned easily, and the door opened into a kitchen that took Eli's breath away with its combination of cleanliness and warmth. Everything was exactly as Martha had left it the morning she died. Coffee cup washed and placed in the dish drainer, breakfast dishes neatly stacked, a shopping list on the counter that would never be fulfilled. The walls were covered with photographs of German shepherds spanning decades, a visual history of the dogs who had shared Martha's life and filled her heart. Scout and Grace knew exactly where they were. They moved through the house with confident familiarity, heading straight for their food and water bowls in the kitchen, then investigating every room, as if checking to make sure everything was still in its proper place. Grace spent several minutes in what was obviously Martha's bedroom, her nose pressed against the bedspread where Martha's scent still lingered. Eli found himself in the most well-organized home he'd ever seen. Every closet was neat, every drawer organized with care. The refrigerator contained enough food for a week, and the pantry was stocked with the kind of bulk supplies that suggested someone who planned ahead and shopped efficiently. In the laundry room, he discovered what must have been 50 pounds of high-quality dog food, along with toys, treats, and grooming supplies that represented a significant investment in the puppy's future. But it was the living room that revealed the depth of Martha's character. The walls were covered with certificates and photographs from her nursing career, awards for exceptional service, and pictures of colleagues at retirement parties and hospital events. A bookshelf held medical texts alongside dog training manuals and works of poetry. The furniture was comfortable but not expensive, chosen for function rather than style. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, Eli found a collection of handwritten thank you notes from patients and their families, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves and arranged chronologically over nearly 4 decades of nursing. The messages told the story of a woman who had made the worst moments of people's lives more bearable through her presence and care. "You held my hand when I was scared," read one note from 1987. "You made my father's last days peaceful," said another from 2003. The puppies had settled on their familiar couch, finally relaxed for the first time since Martha's death. Scout sprawled across the cushions with the boneless abandon of a sleeping puppy, while Grace maintained her more dignified posture, but allowed her eyes to drift closed. This was their home, the place where they understood the rules and felt safe. Eli realized he was crying, tears running down his cheeks as he stood in the living room of a woman he'd never formally met, but who had probably saved his life with her quiet acts of kindness. The contrast between Martha's orderly, purposeful life and his own decade of aimless survival was almost too painful to acknowledge. She had built something meaningful, had touched lives and made a difference, had created a home that radiated warmth and love even in her absence. He found Martha's personal papers in a desk drawer, along with her will and final instructions. She had indeed died without family, her estate designated for the county animal shelter, with specific provisions for any pets she might leave behind. The puppies were legally orphans, wards of the state, unless someone stepped forward to claim them. The bureaucratic language couldn't hide the tragedy. 2 magnificent animals who had known nothing but love were now officially homeless, their future dependent on the kindness of strangers and the efficiency of an overburdened system. But sitting in Martha's living room, watching Scout and Grace sleep peacefully for the first time in days, Eli began to feel something he hadn't experienced in 10 years, the desire to fight for something that mattered. These puppies weren't just animals who needed care. They were living testimonies to Martha's capacity for love, breathing evidence that goodness persisted even in a world that seemed designed to break hearts. He couldn't give them back their old life, couldn't resurrect Martha or restore their sense of security, but he could make sure they didn't face their uncertain future alone. Whatever happened next, whoever ultimately claimed them, they would know that someone had cared enough to see them through the hard transition between their old life and whatever came next. The decision felt like the first real choice he'd made. In a decade, the first time he'd chosen to move towards something instead of away from it. For 10 years, every decision had been about avoidance. Avoiding people, avoiding responsibility, avoiding the pain that came with caring about anything beyond basic survival. But sitting in Martha's living room, watching the puppies sleep in their familiar surroundings, Eli felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with running away. He would fight for them. He would figure out how to become the kind of man who deserved their trust, who could provide the stability and love they needed to thrive. Martha had seen that potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself, and her faith had created an obligation that transcended his own fears and limitations. The puppies stirred as evening settled over the house, Scout stretching with the boneless grace of youth, while Grace maintained her more dignified posture even in sleep. They were growing so quickly that Eli could see changes from day to day. Longer legs, broader chests, the distinctive German Shepherd features becoming more pronounced as they left puppyhood behind. They would be magnificent dogs, worthy of Martha's love and capable of bringing joy to whatever family eventually claimed them. But for now, for however long this arrangement lasted, they were his responsibility and his companions. The weight of that commitment felt both terrifying and liberating, a return to purpose that he'd thought was lost forever. As darkness fell over Millbrook, Eli gathered the puppies for the walk back to their temporary shelter in the woods. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight he would sleep knowing that 3 lost souls had found each other in their need, and that sometimes the most broken people were exactly what broken hearts needed to begin healing. Again, the photograph album sat on Martha's coffee table like a window into a life well lived. Eli discovered it during his 3rd visit to the house, hidden beneath a stack of dog fancy magazines and veterinary newsletters. The leather cover was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the pages inside chronicled 40 years of German shepherds who had shared Martha's heart and home. The earliest photographs dated back to 1983, showing a young Martha with her first dog, a magnificent male named Kaiser, who looked remarkably similar to Scout in his confident posture and alert expression. The pictures captured training sessions in the backyard, camping trips to mountain lakes, and quiet moments of companionship that spoke to a bond deeper than simple pet ownership. Kaiser appeared in photographs spanning 13 years, from puppyhood through dignified old age, his graying muzzle in the final picture's testament to a life thoroughly loved. After Kaiser came Greta, a female with Grace's thoughtful eyes and elegant bearing. Then Baron, another male who had lived to 15 and died only 2 years before Martha adopted Scout and Grace. Each dog was documented with the careful attention of someone who understood that time passes too quickly and memories fade without physical reminders. There were pictures of Christmas mornings with dogs wearing festive bandanas, birthday celebrations with special dog cakes, and countless ordinary moments made precious by Martha's devotion to preserving them. But it was the photographs from Martha's nursing career that stopped Eli cold. Tucked between pages of dog pictures were images from hospital charity events, retirement parties, and informal gatherings that revealed another side of her character. She had been deeply loved by her colleagues, sought after for her expertise, and respected for her advocacy on behalf of patients who had no one else to speak for them. One photograph showed Martha receiving an award for 30 years of service, her face radiant with pride and surrounded by co-workers who obviously considered her family. Another captured her leading a support group for families dealing with terminal diagnoses, her expression radiating the kind of calm strength that could anchor people during their worst storms. These weren't formal posed shots, but candid moments that revealed someone who had found profound purpose in alleviating suffering and offering comfort when cure wasn't possible. The parallels to his own lost life were unmistakable and painful. Eli had once been that kind of person, someone others sought out for his expertise and reliability. He'd been the carpenter other contractors called when they needed work done right, the man neighbors trusted to transform their vision into reality. His business cards had read, "Hartwell Construction built to last," and he'd meant every word of that promise. Scout and Grace had established their own routine during these visits to Martha's house. They would spend the first hour investigating every room, as if hoping to find some trace of their beloved owner they'd missed on previous visits. Then they would settle into their familiar spots. Scout on his favorite section of couch, Grace on the rug beside Martha's reading chair, and watch Eli with patient curiosity as he worked his way through their former home. He had begun organizing Martha's affairs with the same methodical approach he'd once brought to construction projects. Her bills were sorted and paid using funds from her checking account. Her mail was collected and forwarded to the attorney handling her estate. Her plants were watered and her garden tended, partly out of respect for her memory, but mostly because the routine gave structure to days that might otherwise spiral into the kind of purposeless despair he'd been fighting for a decade. The work was healing him in ways he didn't fully understand. Using Martha's computer to research puppy nutrition and training techniques engaged intellectual muscles that had atrophied during his years in the woods. Reading her veterinary records and making notes about Scout and Grace's health history gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Sarah's death. But it was the discovery of Martha's own story that truly changed his perspective. In a box tucked away in her bedroom closet, he found journals that revealed she hadn't always been the stable, nurturing person suggested by her organized home and successful career. The earliest entries, dated from the late 1970s, told the story of a young woman struggling with depression and alcohol abuse following her mother's death from cancer. Martha had been homeless for 6 months in 1979, living out of her car and working temporary jobs while battling addiction and grief that threatened to destroy her completely. Her recovery had been slow and imperfect, marked by relapses and setbacks that she documented with unflinching honesty. But gradually, through therapy and support groups, and the kind of day-by-day persistence that addicts know intimately, she had rebuilt her life from nothing. Her decision to become a nurse had grown directly from her experience with homelessness and addiction. She wanted to work with people who understood suffering, who needed advocates willing to see past their circumstances to the human beings struggling underneath. Her specialty in hospice care had developed from her belief that everyone deserved dignity and comfort during their most vulnerable moments, regardless of their history or social status. The parallels to Eli's situation were impossible to ignore. Martha had known exactly what it felt like to lose everything worth keeping, to watch your life disintegrate despite your best efforts to hold it together. She had understood the particular kind of despair that comes from being invisible to a world that judges worth by external circumstances. Her gifts tied to trees in the forest hadn't been charity dispensed from a position of superiority. They had been offerings from someone who remembered hunger and cold and the crushing weight of believing you were beyond redemption. Reading her journals, Eli began to understand that Martha's kindness toward him had been deeply personal. She had seen not just a homeless man who needed help, but a fellow traveler on the difficult path between losing everything and finding the courage to rebuild. Her food and blankets had been accompanied by something even more valuable, the unspoken message that recovery was possible, that people could survive devastating loss and create meaningful lives on the other side of their worst moments. The puppies seemed to sense his emotional state during these reading sessions. Grace would position herself close enough to provide physical comfort, her warm body pressed against his leg as he sat on Martha's couch working through her papers. Scout, more active in his support, would periodically bring Eli toys or approach, for brief petting sessions that seemed designed to pull him back from whatever dark thoughts threatened to overwhelm him. Their trust was growing daily, transforming from desperate dependence into something deeper and more mutual. Scout had begun following Eli around the house, supervising his activities with the focused attention of a quality control inspector. Grace showed her affection more quietly, through gentle nudges and the way she relaxed completely in his presence, vulnerable in the way that only comes with absolute faith in someone's goodness. But challenges were emerging that threatened their fragile stability. Eli's supplies were running dangerously low, and Martha's pantry, however well stocked, wouldn't last forever. Winter was approaching with the remorseless inevitability of mountain weather, and his shelter in the woods wouldn't be adequate for 3 occupants during the harsh months ahead. Most urgently, both puppies needed veterinary care and socialization that he couldn't provide from his position on society's margins. The solution would require him to interact with people in ways he'd been avoiding for nearly a decade. He would need to trust others, to reveal his situation and ask for help, to risk the judgment and rejection that had driven him into isolation in the first place. The thought terrified him, but watching Scout and Grace sleep peacefully in their familiar home, he knew he would find the courage to face those fears. They had already given him something invaluable, a reason to care about the future, a purpose worth fighting for despite the obstacles ahead. The wedding ring had been missing for so long that Eli had convinced himself it was lost forever, probably dropped somewhere in the woods during one of his darker periods when keeping track of possessions seemed pointless. But there it was, nestled in the corner of his tool pouch, beneath a layer of sawdust and wood shavings that had accumulated over years of disuse. The simple gold band caught the morning light as he searched for measuring tape, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Sarah had chosen the ring herself, saving money from her job at the library to buy matching bands from a jewelry store in the county seat. They'd been married on a Saturday morning in October, with maple leaves falling like confetti around the small church where Sarah's family had worshipped for 3 generations. The ring had never left his finger during their 26 years together, and he'd worn it for 2 more years after her death, unable to accept that their marriage had ended with her last breath. Now holding the ring in his calloused palm, Eli remembered the day he'd finally taken it off. He'd been sitting beside the creek near his shelter, drunk on whiskey and self-pity, when the weight of the gold band had suddenly felt unbearable. Sarah was gone. Their life together existed only in memories that grew more painful with each passing day, and wearing her ring felt like carrying a piece of his heart that had died with her. He'd pulled it off in a moment of anguished desperation and thrown it into the woods, immediately regretting the gesture, but too proud and too broken to search for it in the darkness. Scout found him sitting on Martha's back porch, staring at the ring, with tears running down his weathered cheeks. The puppy approached with the careful sensitivity he'd developed for Eli's emotional states, pressing his warm body against the old man's legs and offering the kind of wordless comfort that only animals seem to understand. Grace joined them a moment later, her presence equally gentle and supportive, as if both puppies recognized that this moment required their full attention and care. "She would have loved you both," Eli said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah always wanted dogs, but we were always too busy with work and life to make time for pets. She used to say we'd get a dog when we retired, when we had more time to train and care for it properly." The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd found his way to dogs only after losing everything else that had given his life meaning. But perhaps that was how healing worked, not as a straight path from pain to peace, but as a series of unexpected connections that gradually rebuilt what trauma had torn apart. Scout and Grace hadn't replaced what he'd lost with Sarah, but they'd created space for new kinds of love that honored his capacity for devotion without demanding that he forget his grief. Dr. Sarah Mitchell discovered them during one of their afternoon visits to Martha's house, her arrival announced by the sound of a car door closing in the driveway. Eli's first instinct was to flee, to gather the puppies and disappear into the woods before this stranger could ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. But Grace's immediate excitement, tail wagging, body wiggling with recognition, told him this was someone the puppies knew and trusted. The woman who appeared around the corner of the house was probably in her 40s, with graying brown hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that marked her as someone who worked with animals. Her face was kind but tired, marked by the particular weariness of someone who dealt with suffering on a daily basis. She stopped when she saw Eli, her expression shifting from surprise to careful assessment. "You must be the man who's been taking care of Martha's puppies," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and professional caution. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, the veterinarian who's been treating them since they were 8 weeks old." The coincidence of her name hit Eli like a physical blow, and he had to steady himself against the porch railing. Of all the people who could have discovered them, it was someone who shared his wife's name and showed the same careful kindness Sarah had extended to every living creature. The puppy's enthusiastic greeting confirmed what Eli had suspected. This was someone they associated with safety and care, a trusted figure from their life with Martha. "I've been wondering where they ended up," Dr. Mitchell continued, settling herself on the porch steps with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to gaining animals' trust. "Martha was supposed to bring them in for their next round of vaccinations 2 weeks ago. When she didn't show up and didn't return my calls, I got worried." Eli found his voice, rusty from disuse but steady enough to convey the basics of their situation. He told her about finding the puppies at Martha's grave, about discovering Martha's key and learning her story through her journals and photographs. He explained his temporary care arrangement, while being careful not to reveal too much about his own circumstances or living situation. Dr. Mitchell listened without judgment, her attention focused equally on Eli's words and the puppy's behavior. Scout and Grace had positioned themselves between the two humans, clearly comfortable with both, but alert to the dynamics of this first meeting between their caregivers. Their body language suggested complete trust in Dr. Mitchell, but also a protective loyalty to Eli that spoke volumes about the bond they'd developed. "They look healthy," she observed, running experienced hands over both puppies to check their weight and condition. "Someone's been taking good care of them." Martha would be grateful to know they landed with someone who understands what they need. The simple acknowledgement of his competence meant more to Eli than any elaborate praise. For 10 years, he'd been treated as invisible at best, a nuisance at worst. To be seen as someone capable of caring for vulnerable creatures, someone worthy of trust and respect, awakened something in him that had been dormant for far too long. "They'll need their booster shot soon," Dr. Mitchell continued, her manner professional but warm. "And they should be spayed and neutered before they reach sexual maturity." Martha had already made appointments for those procedures, but obviously she trailed off, recognizing the sensitivity of the subject. The practical realities of pet ownership were becoming clear to Eli in ways he hadn't fully considered. Veterinary care cost money he didn't have, and keeping large dogs required resources far beyond his current means. Scout and Grace were growing quickly, their appetites increasing daily, and their need for exercise and socialization could only be met by someone with adequate space and community connections. But as he watched Dr. Mitchell interact with the puppies, saw the genuine affection in her touch and the professional expertise in her assessment, Eli began to sense the possibility of an alliance. Here was someone who had known and respected Martha, who understood the puppy's history and needs, and who seemed willing to see past his unconventional circumstances to the care he'd been providing. Would you be willing to continue as their temporary guardian while we figure out a permanent solution? She asked. Her question delivered with the kind of straightforward honesty Eli appreciated. I can help with veterinary care, and I might know some people who could assist with other resources. These are special dogs, and Martha would want them to have every opportunity to find the right permanent home. The offer represented both opportunity and obligation. Accepting would mean revealing more about his situation, trusting another person, with information that could lead to complications or judgment. But it also meant access to professional support for the puppy's needs and recognition of his role in their lives as legitimate and valuable. Looking at Scout and Grace, seeing the trust in their eyes and the contentment in their relaxed postures, Eli made another decision that would reshape all their futures. He would accept Dr. Mitchell's offer, would risk the vulnerability that came with asking for help, because these puppies deserved every advantage he could provide during their transition to whatever came next. The legal document had been sitting in Martha's desk drawer for months, waiting for someone to discover it beneath a stack of veterinary records and dog training certificates. Dr. Mitchell found it during their joint effort to organize Martha's papers for the estate attorney, and her sharp intake of breath told Eli that whatever she was reading would change everything they thought they understood about their situation. "My God," she whispered, holding the papers with trembling hands. "Eli, you need to see this." The document was Martha's updated will, dated just 6 weeks before her death, with modifications that revealed she'd been planning for contingencies no one could have anticipated. The bulk of her modest estate, including her house, savings account and life insurance policy totaling nearly $40,000, was designated for the establishment of a local animal rescue organization. But it was the personal provisions that took Eli's breath away. Martha had specifically allocated funds for the care of any dogs she might leave behind, with detailed instructions about their placement and ongoing support. More shocking still, she had named a backup guardian in case the primary rescue organization couldn't immediately accommodate her pets. Any person currently providing care and shelter for my animals, regardless of their housing situation or economic status, should be supported with whatever resources necessary to continue their guardianship until permanent placement can be arranged. But the real revelation came in Martha's personal letter, sealed in an envelope marked, "For whoever finds Scout and Grace." Dr. Mitchell read it aloud, her voice growing more amazed with each paragraph. "If you are reading this, it means I'm gone, and someone has stepped forward to care for my dogs. I hope that person is Eli, the man who lives in the woods behind Maple Creek. I've been leaving him food and supplies for 3 years, not out of pity but out of recognition. I know who he is, or rather, who he was. Eli Hartwell built the cabinets in my kitchen and the deck where I sit every morning with my coffee. His work has lasted 20 years without a single repair, and his reputation was spotless before tragedy struck his family." Eli felt the world shift around him as Dr. Mitchell continued reading Martha's words, each sentence revealing how much she had known about his situation and how deliberately she had been helping him without ever undermining his dignity. "I was homeless once too, living in my car and working temporary jobs while battling demons that nearly destroyed me completely. I understand the shame that keeps people isolated and the fear that makes asking for help feel impossible. I've watched Eli from my kitchen window, seen him tending the forest with the same care he once brought to building homes. He's not broken. He's healing, just like I was 30 years ago." The letter continued with Martha's observations about Eli's character, documented through years of discreet watching. His careful maintenance of his shelter, his respect for the natural environment, his obvious intelligence and problem-solving skills. She had seen him rescue injured birds, share his food with stray cats, and maintain his small piece of the forest with the attention of someone who understood that dignity came from taking care of whatever space you occupied, regardless of its size or legitimacy. I'm leaving provisions for Eli because I believe he has the capacity to love my dogs the way they deserve to be loved, Martha had written. Not because he needs charity, but because he needs purpose. Scout and Grace will give him something worth fighting for, and he will give them the devotion and protection that only someone who understands loss can provide. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph. Martha had been leaving. More than food and blankets in the woods. Hidden in various locations around Eli's shelter, she had placed sealed containers with money, tools, and supplies specifically intended to help him rebuild his life when he was ready. The letter included a hand-drawn map showing the locations of these hidden caches, along with combinations for the waterproof boxes that had been keeping these resources safe for over a year. Dr. Mitchell looked up from the letter with tears in her eyes, her professional composure completely abandoned in the face of Martha's extraordinary foresight and compassion. She knew Eli. She knew exactly what she was doing when she left those puppies at the cemetery. She was counting on you finding them. The implications were staggering. Martha hadn't died leaving her dogs orphaned. She had died implementing a plan designed to save both her puppies and a man she believed deserved a second chance. The provisions in her will weren't charity, but investment, recognition of Eli's potential value as a guardian and companion for the animals she loved most. Eli found himself shaking as the reality of Martha's gift sank in. She had seen past his circumstances to the person he could become again, had believed in his capacity for recovery and growth, even when he'd lost faith in himself completely. The money she'd left would be enough to rent a small place, to provide proper veterinary care for the puppies, to bridge the gap between his current situation and whatever stable future he could build. But Martha's generosity came with responsibilities that terrified him. The will designated him as the puppy's official guardian if he was willing to accept the role. But it also made clear that this wasn't a temporary arrangement. She expected him to commit to Scout and Grace for their entire lives, to become the kind of dog owner she had been, devoted, responsible, and completely dedicated to their welfare and happiness. "There's more," Dr. Mitchell said softly, pulling another document from the envelope. "She's prepaid veterinary care for both dogs, through their entire lives, including emergency procedures and end-of-life care. She's also allocated funds for a fenced yard and proper housing modifications, plus ongoing support for food and supplies." The scope of Martha's planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness and generosity. She had thought through every practical obstacle that might prevent Eli from succeeding as a pet owner, then systematically addressed each concern with financial resources and professional support. She had even contacted Dr. Mitchell months before her death, explaining the situation and asking for her commitment to provide ongoing veterinary care regardless of Eli's ability to pay. "The question now," Dr. Mitchell said gently, "is whether you're ready to accept what Martha is offering. This isn't just about caring for two puppies anymore. She's giving you the chance to completely rebuild your life, but only if you're willing to take responsibility for these dogs permanently." Eli looked at Scout and Grace, who had been napping peacefully during the adults' conversation, but were now alert to the emotional tension in the room. They studied his face with the intense focus of animals who understood that something important was happening. Something that would affect their future in ways they couldn't comprehend but could sense through the human's behavior. The fear was overwhelming. For 10 years, he'd been responsible only for his own survival, and he'd barely managed that most days. The thought of being accountable for two living creatures who would depend on him completely, who would need stability and care and love for the next 10 to 15 years, felt like agreeing to carry a weight that might crush him. What if he failed them the way he'd failed his family? What if his grief and addiction returned and left them abandoned again? But looking at Martha's letter, reading her words of faith in his capacity for love and responsibility, Eli felt something shift in his chest. For the first time in a decade, someone had looked at him and seen not just what he'd lost, But what he still had to give. Martha had believed he could be the kind of man Scout and Grace deserved, had trusted him with her most precious possessions because she recognized something in him that he'd forgotten existed. The decision, when it came, felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But it also felt like the first real choice he'd made since Sarah's death, the first time he'd chosen hope over despair, future over past, love over fear. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. "I'll take them. I'll be their person." Dr. Mitchell smiled, the expression transforming her tired face with genuine joy. Martha would be so happy. She always said Scout and Grace were meant to save someone, not just be saved. As if they understood the significance of the moment, both puppies approached Eli and settled against his legs, their warm bodies radiating. The trust and affection that had been growing between them since that first night at Martha's grave. They were no longer homeless animals waiting for someone to claim them. They were family, bound together by loss and love, and an extraordinary woman's faith in the power of second chances. The old business license had been tucked away in Eli's personal belongings for so long that he'd forgotten it existed. Dr. Mitchell discovered it while helping him inventory the items he'd need to establish legal residency, a crumpled piece of paper that proved Eli Hartwell Construction had once been a legitimate licensed operation in Millbrook County. The document was dated 15 years before his world collapsed, back when his name had meant something in the construction community and his reputation had been built on quality workmanship and absolute reliability. "This changes everything," Dr. Mitchell said, smoothing out the worn paper with careful hands. "You're not just someone who's good with dogs, Eli. You're a skilled tradesman with an established history in this community. People will remember your work, even if they haven't seen you in years." The legal process of claiming Martha's bequest was more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The county probate system required extensive documentation to prove Eli's identity and competence as a guardian, particularly given his decade-long absence from conventional society. Social services needed to conduct home visits and evaluate his living situation. The estate attorney required character references and evidence of his ability to provide stable care for 2 large dogs. Each requirement felt like a mountain to climb for someone who had spent 10 years avoiding official attention of any kind. Eli's hands shook as he filled out forms that asked for employment history, permanent address, and references who could vouch for his character. The simple act of writing his full name on legal documents felt like claiming an identity he'd thought was lost forever. But Dr. Mitchell had connections throughout the community, and word of Martha's extraordinary legacy began spreading in ways that surprised them both. The story of the homeless man who had rescued Martha's puppies, combined with the revelation that he was the same Eli Hartwell who had built half the custom homes in the county, created a buzz of interest that reached far beyond animal welfare circles. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store on Main Street, was the first to come forward. He remembered Eli from the old days, recalled the precision with which he selected materials and the way other contractors sought his advice on difficult projects. "Eli built my back deck in '98, he told Dr. Mitchell. "Haven't had to touch it since. If he says he'll take care of those dogs, you can believe it." More references followed. Janet Morrison, whose kitchen cabinets Eli had crafted in 2001, drove out to Martha's house specifically to see him and offer her support. "My grandchildren still play in the playhouse you built," she told him, her voice warm with genuine affection. "It's weathered 15 winters without a single repair. Anyone who builds like that understands commitment." The most significant support came from Father Miguel Santos, the priest at St. Anthony's Catholic Church, who had known both Martha and Eli during better times. He offered not just a character reference, but practical assistance, a small apartment above the church rectory that could serve as temporary housing, while Eli used Martha's resources to find permanent accommodations suitable for large dogs. Martha helped plan our annual charity drives for homeless families, Father Santos explained as he showed Eli the modest but clean apartment. She always said the difference between homeless and housed was often just one person willing to take a chance on someone. She'd want us to take that chance on you. The apartment was small but functional, with a kitchenette, bathroom, and sleeping area that felt palatial compared to his shelter in the woods. More importantly, it came with a fenced yard where Scout and Grace could exercise safely, while he navigated the legal and practical challenges of rebuilding his life. The puppies adapted to their new temporary home with the resilience that had characterized their entire ordeal, treating each change as an adventure rather than a crisis. But even with growing community support, Eli faced internal battles that threatened to undermine everything Martha had made possible. The voice in his head that had driven him to the woods 10 years earlier whispered constant doubts. He wasn't worthy of this second chance. He would inevitably disappoint everyone who was helping him. He was too old and too damaged to successfully rebuild a life that had been shattered so completely. The nightmares returned with a vengeance as the stress of legal proceedings and public attention triggered memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. He would wake in the small apartment, gasping for breath, reliving the moment of impact that had changed everything. Seeing Sarah's face in the instant before the other vehicle struck their truck. Scout and Grace learned to respond to these episodes, providing the kind of intuitive comfort that helped ground him in the present moment and remind him that he wasn't alone anymore. Dr. Mitchell became his anchor during the worst moments, offering professional counseling resources and personal support that went far beyond her veterinary obligations. She helped him understand that Martha's gift wasn't charity but recognition, acknowledgement of his value as a person and his potential as a guardian for animals that needed the kind of love only someone who understood loss could provide. Trauma doesn't disqualify you from love, she told him during one of their weekly meetings to discuss the puppy's progress. Sometimes it makes you more capable of it, more aware of how precious and fragile good things can be. Martha knew that when she chose you. The legal hearing was scheduled for the first week of November, with Judge Patricia Reynolds presiding over the formal transfer of Martha's bequest and the legal establishment of Eli's guardianship. The process would be public, covered by the local newspaper that had picked up the story as an example of community compassion and second chances. Eli would need to testify about his commitment to the dogs, his plans for their care, and his readiness to accept the responsibilities that came with Martha's extraordinary gift. Preparing for that moment required confronting every fear and insecurity that had driven him into isolation. He would need to speak publicly about his lowest moments, acknowledge the years he'd spent drinking away his grief, and convince skeptical officials that he was capable of providing the stability and care that Scout and Grace deserved. The weight of their future rested on his ability to prove that Martha's faith in him had been justified. But as the hearing date approached, Eli found strength in unexpected places. Scout and Grace had grown into magnificent young dogs whose obvious health and happiness testified to the quality of care they'd received under his guardianship. Their training was progressing beautifully, their socialization with other people and animals was excellent, and their bond with Eli was deep and obvious. To anyone who observed them together, more importantly, he was rediscovering skills and confidence that had been dormant for years. Using Martha's bequest to purchase proper tools and materials, he had begun small woodworking projects in the church basement, creating custom dog beds and training equipment that showcased the craftsmanship he'd never really lost. Father Santos had been so impressed with the quality of the work that he'd commissioned Eli to build new pews for the chapel, a project that would provide both income and visible proof of his capabilities. The night before the hearing, Eli sat in the small apartment watching Scout and Grace sleep peacefully in their custom beds, their breathing deep and content in the way that only comes with absolute security. In 10 months, they had transformed from traumatized puppies waiting at a graveside to confident young dogs ready to take on whatever adventures life might offer. Their transformation had paralleled his own journey from despair to hope, from isolation to community, from surviving to actually living. Martha's photograph sat on the kitchen table where he could see it every day, her gentle smile a constant reminder of the faith someone had placed in his capacity for love and responsibility. Tomorrow would determine whether that faith had been justified, whether the legal system would recognize what Martha and the growing circle of supporters had already acknowledged, that sometimes the most unlikely guardians are exactly what lost. Souls need to find their way home. Whatever the judge decided, Eli knew that Martha's real gift hadn't been money or legal provisions. It had been the restoration of his belief that he still had something valuable to offer the world. Scout and Grace had given him a reason to care about tomorrow, and caring about tomorrow had made it possible to forgive himself for yesterday. That transformation was complete, regardless of any legal outcome. A victory that no courtroom decision could diminish or enhance. But as he prepared for sleep, listening to the gentle sounds of his dogs settling in for the night, Eli allowed himself to hope for the official recognition that would make their family complete and permanent. They had already saved each other in all the ways that mattered. Tomorrow would determine whether the rest of the world was ready to acknowledge what the three of them already knew, that love doesn't require perfect circumstances, only perfect commitment. The character reference letter had 17 signatures. By the time Dr. Mitchell presented it to the court clerk, each name representing someone who had been touched by either Eli's craftsmanship from years past or his dedication to Scout and Grace in recent months. The document had grown organically as word spread through Millbrook about the hearing, with community members stepping forward to add their voices to what had become a testament to the power of second chances. Judge Patricia Reynolds entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, her black robes rustling as she settled behind the bench that overlooked the modest chamber where county business was conducted. She was known throughout the region as a fair but thorough jurist, someone who took her responsibilities seriously and wasn't swayed by sentiment when legal requirements hadn't been met. The bailiff called the session to order, and Eli felt his heart hammering against his ribs as his case was announced to the small gathering of observers. Scout and Grace sat perfectly beside his chair, their behavior impeccable despite the unfamiliar surroundings and the tension they could sense radiating from their guardian. Dr. Mitchell had spent weeks preparing them for this moment, ensuring they would demonstrate the training and socialization that proved Eli's competence as their caretaker. Their calm presence was the most powerful testimony he could offer, living proof that Martha's faith in his abilities had been justified. The estate attorney presented the basic facts of Martha's bequest, outlining her provisions for the dog's care and her specific designation of Eli as their intended guardian. The legal language was formal and clinical, but underneath the bureaucratic terminology lay Martha's extraordinary act of faith in a man the world had forgotten. Judge Reynolds listened attentively, occasionally making notes, but revealing nothing of her thoughts through her professional demeanor. When called to testify, Eli approached the witness stand on unsteady legs, his dress shirt borrowed from Father Santos, feeling strange after years of wearing whatever clothes he could salvage or afford. The courtroom fell silent as he was sworn in, every eye focused on the man whose story had captured the community's imagination and divided opinion about whether homeless individuals could successfully transition back into responsible citizenship. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Reynolds began, her voice neither warm nor cold, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Please tell the court about your relationship with these animals and your understanding of the responsibilities you're asking." "To assume," Eli's voice cracked on the first words, forcing him to clear his throat and start again. Your Honor, I found Scout and Grace at Martha Henderson's graveside on the day of her funeral. They were waiting for her to come home, and I knew exactly how that felt. He paused, gathering courage from the steady presence of the dogs who watched him from their position near the defendant's table. I've been where they were, lost, confused, not understanding why the person who loved me most was suddenly gone forever. The judge's expression remained neutral, but Eli caught a slight softening around her eyes that encouraged him to continue. He spoke about those first terrifying nights when he'd been responsible for keeping the puppies alive, about learning to put their needs before his own comfort and safety. His voice grew stronger as he described the routine they'd established, the training progress they'd made, and the way caring for them had given him purpose he hadn't felt since his wife's death. I know what the court records show about my past 10 years, Eli said, meeting Judge Reynolds' gaze directly. I know I look like a poor risk, someone who abandoned his responsibilities and disappeared from society. But these dogs have reminded me who I used to be, and Martha's gift has given me the resources to become that person again. The cross-examination came from a social services representative who questioned whether someone with Eli's history could provide the stability large dogs required. She cited statistics about recidivism among people recovering from homelessness and addiction, expressed concerns about his ability to afford ongoing veterinary care despite Martha's provisions, and suggested that younger, more established families would provide better environments for the animal's development. Each question felt like a physical blow, designed to expose every weakness and failure that had led to his exile from conventional society. But as the interrogation continued, Eli found his answers becoming more confident, more grounded in the concrete evidence of his transformation over the past months. He spoke about the community support he'd received, the apartment Father Santos had provided, and the woodworking commissions that were beginning to restore his financial independence. The dogs aren't just pets to me, he said during a particularly pointed question about his commitment. They're family. Martha understood that I needed them as much as they needed me. Taking care of them has taught me how to take care of myself. Again, Scout seemed to sense the hostility in the social worker's questioning, because he rose from his position and walked calmly to the witness stand, sitting perfectly at Eli's feet in a display of loyalty that spoke louder than any testimony. Grace followed a moment later, positioning herself on Eli's other side, with the same dignified composure her mother would have admired. The courtroom stirred at this unprecedented demonstration of the bond between man and dogs. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, her professional mask slipping enough to reveal genuine interest in what she was witnessing. Mr. Hartwell, did you train them to do that? No, Your Honor, Eli replied, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at his companions. They trained me. They taught me what it means to be someone worth depending on again. The wooden doghouse sat in the courtroom's evidence area, like a testament to transformation, its clean lines and perfect joinery showcasing craftsmanship that spoke of patience, skill, and deep love. Eli had spent 3 weeks building it in the church basement, working with hand tools and measuring twice before every cut, rediscovering the meditative rhythm that had once defined his professional life. The project had been Dr. Mitchell's suggestion, concrete proof that his commitment to Scout and Grace extended beyond basic care to the kind of thoughtful provision that excellent pet owners provided. Tom Bradley from the hardware store was the first character witness to take the stand, his weathered hands gesturing toward the doghouse as he spoke. Judge Reynolds, I sold Eli the lumber for that house, and I watched him select every board. He rejected pieces I would have sold to other customers, looking for grain patterns that would weather well and joints that would hold tight for decades. That's not the behavior of someone planning a temporary arrangement. Janet Morrison followed, her voice steady as she described the playhouse Eli had built for her grandchildren 15 years earlier. It's still standing, Your Honor, still solid as the day he finished it. My grandson is using it now with his own children. When someone builds like that, they're thinking about generations, not just getting by. But it was Father Santos whose testimony seemed to reach Judge Reynolds most directly. The elderly priest spoke with quiet authority about Martha's character, her deliberate planning for her pet's future, and her specific choice of Eli as their guardian. Martha Henderson was not a sentimental woman, Your Honor. She was a practical nurse who made life and death decisions for 37 years. When she chose Mr. Hartwell to care for Scout and Grace, she did so based on careful observation and sound judgment. The social services representative made one final attempt to challenge the arrangement, arguing that the county animal shelter could provide more conventional placement with a pre-approved family. But as she spoke, Grace rose from her position beside Eli's chair and approached the witness stand with dignified purpose, sitting perfectly in front of the social worker and fixing her with an unblinking stare that suggested she had strong opinions. About this suggestion, the courtroom erupted in quiet laughter, and even Judge Reynolds smiled as Grace maintained her position until the social worker finished her statement and returned to her seat. The dog then walked calmly back to Eli, settling beside him with the satisfied air of someone who had made her point clearly and effectively. Dr. Mitchell provided the final testimony, presenting Scout and Grace's veterinary records and describing their remarkable progress under Eli's care. These dogs were traumatized by their owner's sudden death, Your Honor, but they've shown no behavioral problems, no regression in their training, no signs of stress or neglect. Their coats are glossy, their weight is perfect, and their socialization has actually improved since Mr. Hartwell became their guardian. She paused, looking directly at Judge Reynolds with the confidence of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. I've been a veterinarian for 20 years, and I can tell you that the bond between these animals and Mr. Hartwell is extraordinary. They've chosen him just as clearly as he's chosen them. Separating them now would be traumatic for all parties involved. Judge Reynolds called a brief recess, during which she reviewed Martha's will, the character references, and the veterinary records that documented Scout and Grace's excellent health and development. Eli sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, his hands shaking despite his best efforts to appear calm, while community members who had come to support him offered quiet words of encouragement. When court reconvened, Judge Reynolds took her time, arranging her papers before speaking, her expression serious but no longer unreadable. This court has reviewed all testimony and evidence presented today, as well as the specific provisions Ms. Henderson made in her will regarding the care of her animals. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as she continued. It's clear that Ms. Henderson made her decision based on careful observation and specific knowledge of Mr. Hartwell's character and capabilities. The evidence presented today supports her judgment. Mr. Hartwell has demonstrated not only his ability to provide excellent care for these animals, but his commitment to their long-term welfare and happiness. Scout and Grace seemed to sense the importance of the moment, because they both rose and positioned themselves directly in front of the judge's bench, their posture alert and dignified as they waited for the words that would determine their future. Therefore, Judge Reynolds announced, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority, but also a warmth that hadn't been present earlier, this court hereby approves the transfer of Martha Henderson's bequest to Elijah Hartwell, along with permanent guardianship of the animals known as Scout and Grace. Mr. Hartwell, you are now legally responsible for these dogs' welfare, with all the rights and obligations that entails. The courtroom erupted in applause as Eli felt his knees buckle. With relief and joy, Scout and Grace seemed to understand that something wonderful had happened, because they both pressed against him with tails wagging furiously, their entire bodies radiating the happiness of animals whose security had been officially confirmed. Dr. Mitchell was crying openly as she embraced Eli, and Father Santos made the sign of the cross with obvious relief. But it was the sight of Martha's photograph, which Dr. Mitchell had brought as evidence, that moved Eli most deeply. The gentle woman who had seen his potential when he couldn't see it himself had achieved her final goal, ensuring that her beloved dogs would spend their lives with someone who understood the true meaning of devotion. They were officially a family now, bound together by legal documents and community recognition, but more importantly, by the kind of love that transforms broken individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. The simple wooden sign reading, "Home," had taken Eli 3 evenings to carve, working by lamplight at the kitchen table of the small house he'd rented on the outskirts of Millbrook. Each letter was shaped with the patient precision that had once made him the most sought-after Finnish carpenter in the county, the wood grain flowing around the words like water around stones in a stream. Scout and Grace supervised the project from their beds nearby, occasionally lifting their heads to check his progress with the focused attention of quality control inspectors. 6 months had passed since Judge Reynolds had made their family official, and the transformation in all their lives felt like something out of a fairy tale that had somehow wandered into the real world. The house sat on 2 acres of fenced property, with enough space for the dogs to run and play without endangering passing traffic or neighboring livestock. Eli had built them an elaborate outdoor obstacle course, complete with jumps, tunnels, and weaving poles that challenged their intelligence while providing the exercise their growing bodies required. Martha's financial provisions had been even more generous than anyone had initially understood. Beyond the immediate bequest, she had established a trust that would provide ongoing support for Scout and Grace's care throughout their entire lives, along with funds for Eli's modest living expenses while he rebuilt his carpentry business. The arrangement gave him freedom to be selective about projects, choosing work that challenged his skills and allowed him to maintain the high standards that had once defined his professional reputation. The first major commission had come from an unexpected source. The county courthouse needed new jury benches, and Judge Reynolds had specifically requested that Eli submit a bid for the project. The irony wasn't lost on him that he would be crafting furniture for the same courtroom where his fitness as a guardian had been evaluated, but the symbolism felt appropriate. He was building something that would serve justice and community needs for decades to come. Using skills that Martha had helped him rediscover, Dr. Mitchell had become more than Scout and Grace's veterinarian. She had evolved into a close friend whose weekly visits provided both professional consultation and personal connection that enriched all their lives. She often brought her own dog, an elderly golden retriever named Murphy, for play dates that delighted Scout and Grace and gave them valuable socialization with other well-trained animals. The friendship between the humans had developed alongside the canine relationships, built on shared commitment to animal welfare and mutual respect for each other's expertise. But it was the weekly visits to Martha's grave that provided the deepest sense of completion and continuity. Every Sunday after church, Eli would drive Scout and Grace to the cemetery where their story had begun, bringing fresh flowers for Martha's headstone and spending time in quiet reflection about the journey that had brought them all to this point. The dogs seemed to understand the significance of these visits, settling peacefully beside the grave while Eli spoke to Martha about their progress and adventures. "They're doing beautifully," he would tell her, his voice carrying the kind of conversational tone people use when speaking to beloved family members who happen to be absent. "Scout passed his canine good citizen test last week, and Grace is showing real aptitude for therapy work. Dr. Mitchell thinks she might enjoy visiting nursing homes, bringing comfort to people who need it most." The memorial bench he'd built and installed near Martha's grave had become a gathering place for other pet owners who came to visit their own departed companions. Constructed from weather-resistant cedar and designed with clean lines that would age gracefully, It bore a simple brass plaque, "In memory of Martha Henderson, who understood that love multiplies when shared." The bench provided a place for quiet contemplation and served as a lasting testament to the woman whose faith in second chances had transformed 3 lives. Eli's relationship with his daughter Claire had been slowly healing through carefully worded letters and occasional phone calls. She lived in Colorado now, married to a teacher and raising 2 children who knew they had a grandfather but hadn't yet met him. The conversations were tentative, marked by years of hurt and misunderstanding, but they carried the possibility of eventual reconciliation. Claire had sent photographs of her family, and Eli had responded with pictures of Scout and Grace, finding it easier to share his current happiness than to explain his past despair. "Maybe next summer," she had said during their most recent phone call, "the kids and I could come visit. They've been asking about the dogs you wrote about in your letters." The invitation was qualified and careful, but it represented progress that had seemed impossible during his years in the woods. Scout and Grace would be excellent ambassadors for the new life he'd built, living proof that healing was possible and second chances could lead to genuine happiness. The small carpentry shop he'd established in the converted barn behind his house was beginning to attract attention from customers who remembered his reputation and others who had heard about his remarkable comeback. The work was satisfying in ways that went beyond financial necessity, engaging skills and creativity that had been dormant for too long. Each project was a meditation on transformation, raw materials becoming useful beauty through patience, precision, and care. Late evenings found Eli on the front porch with Scout and Grace, watching the sun set behind the mountains while planning the next day's work and reflecting on the unlikely path that had led them to this contentment. The dogs were fully grown now, magnificent animals whose intelligence and loyalty exceeded even Martha's optimistic expectations. Their presence had taught him that love didn't require perfection, only commitment, and that families could be created from the most unpromising circumstances. The wooden home sign hung beside the front door now, weathered by its first winter, but still clearly readable to anyone who might need its message. It marked not just a physical address, but a state of being, a recognition that belonging was possible for anyone willing to accept responsibility for something beyond their own survival. Martha had understood that truth when she made her extraordinary bequest, trusting that broken people could heal each other through the simple act of caring. As darkness settled over the valley and Scout and Grace dozed peacefully at his feet, Eli felt the deep satisfaction that comes from promises kept and faith justified. They had all found their way home, guided by love that had survived loss and grown stronger through adversity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight belonged to gratitude for the miraculous ordinary moments that made life worth living.